NSFW, people who have found a dead body, what's the story? Someone I know retired from the Royal Mail because he found someone. He looked through the letter box of an elderly lady who usually came to the door for him, but he hadn't seen in a week. She had had a stroke and fallen on a plug-in heater. I was maybe 12 or 13, walking to the local convenience store with friends. We took a path through the woods that ends up behind a neighborhood pool fence and eventually brings you to the back of the store. Body was laying behind the store in the grass. Called 911 on the payphone out front. Turned out to be a tutor/teacher whose student of hers, who also lived in the neighborhood, had strangled to death and dumped the body. Was laying in bed watching TV with my GF at the time, and her dad had moved in with us recently. Heard the loudest snoring ever coming out of his room real early, and we almost went to check on him, but figured he just had a long night and was exhausted. Got up, went throughout the day, breakfast, chores, all the Saturday morning stuff we do. 2 p.m. rolls around and he still hasn't come out of his room. Had a bad feeling, so I kicked the door in and found him sitting there in his underwear, pale bluish white eyes and mouth open. Apparently he'd gone out with some friends, and they gave him some dope, which turned out to be mostly fentanyl. The snoring we heard was a death rattle, and he was already dead before we even went to sleep. My freshman year of college, right during winter finals, my closest college friend who liked to prank me was in his bed, ignoring his alarm. His roommate came to get me to wake him up. It was a lofted bed. I figured it was a setup. I climbed up there and immediately knew something was horribly wrong and yelled for someone to call for help. His face is still burned into my mind, over 20 years later. I would describe it as scared, with his eyes wide open and his mouth agape as if he were gasping or trying to scream. His hands gripped his sheets tightly. An hour plus of attempts to revive him in the dorm hallway failed. We found out later that he grew up with heart-related issues and his aorta tore in his sleep, before his 19th birthday. Before we learned the cause, I barely slept for weeks. I was terrified whatever got him was getting me next, because we spent so much time together. All these years later, and I'm still in loose contact with his family. On my way to work at 3:30 in the morning, I was carpooling with 2 other guys. We were going through Walcott, Connecticut. Anyone that knows that area knows there's a lot of woods. Anyway, I noticed brake lights that were illuminated behind some trees, so I pulled over to check it out. It was this red SUV blasting reggaeton. The driver had his head slumped down like he was sleeping. I noticed about 20 open beers in the back seat, so we thought he was just drunk. We started to knock on the door to wake him up while we waited for the cops to show up. About 5 minutes later, a cop car pulls up. Officer goes to the driver's side and turns on his flashlight. The second it turned on, we immediately saw the bullet holes on the side of the driver's side door. In like less than a minute, there was at least 10 cop cars shutting everything down. My uncle was supposed to take my dad to a doctor's appointment and never turned up. I went to check and found him dead on his living room floor. Do not recommend. I came home to find my roommate dead in the bathtub after she intentionally took a lot of epilepsy pills and likely seized in the tub and drowned. That hurt a lot. Edit, this gained a lot more traction than anticipated. Not sure which medication she was on, but we found pages she had printed off with warnings and potential side effects of misuse. She either just fell asleep or seized, both were listed as side effects of overdosing. A few years ago, I saw a body lying face down in the River Clyde. It was early morning as I was on my way to work and they had got tangled up in some rocks. Some other people walking along the same path also saw them and I had to stop them from trying to get down to the body. You could tell from the way the body was bloated that they couldn't be saved, and I phoned the police to come. Was a weird day in work after that. Was out driving one night in college with my ex. We used to just go on long drives together to talk about stuff and get away from the university. We were maybe 45 minutes into the country under a pitch-black sky filled with stars and came over a hill to see two red tail lights off in a field. It was so dark that was all we could see until we got closer and saw it was a car crashed directly into a willow tree and the driver was all mangled and dead in the driver's seat / partially out the windshield. We called the cops, but since it was in the middle of nowhere it took a bit to get service and then a bit longer for them to get out to us. Saddest thing about it was that the driver was a teenager. I typically like to enjoy my cup of coffee early in the morning while I skate around the park near me. On the day after Halloween, I went through my normal routine but come across a body hanging in a tree. At first, I thought it was a very realistic decoration / prank, but as I got closer, it was clearly a dead body. He had left his bike and a backpack next to the tree stump. I did not feel the need to go through his belongings. I kind of froze up for a second there until a jogger came by and her reaction snapped me back into reality. We called emergency services, and they came shortly after and cleaned up. When I told my friends and boss what happened, it took them a while to believe my story since they all thought it was a leftover Halloween decoration. I don't know why the 911 call wasn't convincing enough. I kept looking on the internet to find an obituary or an article related to the situation for proof, but nothing came out as far as I could tell. There was a terrible accident on the freeway on a holiday weekend. An SUV with a cargo full of cousins was pulled to the side with some sort of mechanical issue. A semi whose driver was hopped up on meth hit the back of the SUV. Because none of the kids were seatbelt, two were thrown out of the vehicle. One landed in the middle of the freeway and was instantly dead. The other was further out, and I found her. Her neck was obviously broken and, how do I say this gracefully, she wasn't in one piece. It was horrible and traumatic, and I'll never forget my 911 call and the horror of seeing an 8-year-old like that. I was going to testify, but the driver pleaded out. Gabby and Gracie were their names. Was 20 when I found my best friend hanging from a pipe. When we got him out of there, we found several 30 packs of beer in his closet. He wanted us to have a party as we sent him off. My best friend hung himself from the monkey bars in his backyard with a dog leash. I found him hanging there and tried to save him by holding his legs and lifting him up. Vomit all over me, and that smell. Fuck. I moved to a different state years later, and in high school I had a teacher who was talking about how one of his students in state I came from died by a dog leash hanging. Turned out to be the same kid. My then teacher was the principal of the school my friend attended, and my friend was always in trouble in the principal's office, so they knew each other well. A few years after I graduated, the teacher was arrested for charges of statutory sex offense and taking indecent liberties with a child. A fucking 3-year-old. I still think he had something to do with my friend's suicide. Edit, he was 10, I was 8. 16, found my friend's body. She committed suicide. The discovery still haunts me, and I miss her dearly. Depending on the person depends on how they handle it, and I wasn't mentally healthy at the time, so it did a number on me. I'm 29 now, and got into therapy last year, so it's better late than never. I was on a bus in India. The bus stopped and I looked out the window. This old man was lying on the top of this stone wall and his eyes were open. A fly landed on it and he didn't blink. There were lots of other people also sitting on the same wall, not far away. They didn't seem to care. The bus rolled on. I grew up in the lawless 90s in a post-Soviet country. When I was 10, some Jayas robbed a money exchange place. This place belonged to the mafia. They hunted the robbers down and shot the car with the robbers in front of our house. I was playing outside. My parents decided to move to Germany shortly after. I was an intern and was looking for aquatic snails off a busy road. There was a path that led from the road down to a river. I had just arrived and was getting my bearings and noticed something against a trunk of a tree. I walked over and realized it was a man who had hung himself. He was in an almost sitting position. He was wearing light blue pants and a gray t-shirt. His skin was the color of the bark, so he blended in really well. In college, a good friend of mine/roommate had cancer. She spent a majority of time working in her room with the door shut. I went to check in on her after she told me she wasn't feeling well during the weekend. When there was no answer knocking on the door, I barred get in to see her in bed. Upon seeing her, I already knew. Blood settled in her shoulders, but confirmed it when her skin felt like ice. Her aunt later told me her doctor gave the prognosis that she had less than 5 years to live. She never even told her closest friends about it. When I was 12, my dad and I were driving down a logging road to a lake to go fishing. I looked out my window and saw what I thought was someone laying in the ditch. It took some convincing, but my dad turned around and we went back. He pulled over and we got out to check it out. There was a man laying in the ditch unresponsive and wasn't breathing. We flagged down another vehicle and sent them back to the highway so they can get to a house and call the police. Turned out, the guy was from a group of people that were camping. He had got drunk and wandered off. They determined he passed out in the ditch and had vomited in his sleep and choked on it. I was living with my invalid uncle to help him with things he could do, driving, grocery shopping, etc. He'd been in and out of the hospital and was trending downward. It was a Monday. I was getting ready to go to work and he was more out of breath than normal and speaking more weakly than normal. I asked if he was going to be okay and if I should stay home. He said he'd be okay and a nurse was going to come by later on, so I went to work. 10 hours later, I came home and he was on the floor of his room, cold and stiff. Obligatory Reddit, not me but my brother worked as a garbage truck driver in a fairly remote mountain town for about 10 years. He was the one that discovered 3 separate dead bodies of elderly customers. The reason being not that he's shady, this wasn't a Dexter episode, okay, but because he's such a chatterbox and would make it a point to go out of his way to chat with elderly customers. He was much more aware of patterns and could tell when something wasn't right. 2 of them were discovered fairly quickly through my brother peeping through a front window and seeing them slumped in a chair or on the floor. One he could detect by smell as well as the person's cat howling in the locked garage, and authorities went in and discovered the remains. He got Christmas gifts for years afterwards from one of the customer's adult children as a sort of thank you for watching over their parent in that way. Was a dog walker. Picked this girl's dog up 5 days a week and had gotten to know her a bit. One day she asks me to watch her dog for a couple months. It seemed sketchy. It wasn't long after that I opened the door to her place, and there she was, hanging. Fucking sucked. I would frequently carry her dog around singing Landslide by Fleetwood Mac and silently crying in the next few months. Thankfully a coworker of mine kept the doggo for a few months. That coworker also ended up dying of an OD. I had a really hard time with anxiety and jump scares for quite a while after. I'm 90% sure she hung herself with a slip lead she got from me, so using those daily only reinforced the trauma. Old lady lived next door, my family was friends with. Her daughter called one day because she hadn't heard from her mother, asked me to go check. I checked, the lady was dead in her chair with the TV on. Not my story, but too good not to share. I'm a criminal defense investigator, and one of my colleagues was telling me about how they discovered the victim in a murder case he was on. Back in the 90s, some folks had a dispute over an illegal pot grow. One of them ends up dead, so the other 2 dump his body way out in the woods somewhere and go their separate ways. Fast forward to a few years ago, and the local sheriff's department is taking a group of police explorers, high school kids who are interested in going into law enforcement, out to the woods to teach them how to comb a crime scene. They grid out an area and have the kids go over it like they're looking for evidence. After a bit, one of the kids goes up to a deputy and says, "We found the fake skeleton you hid." "What fake skeleton?" Didn't find it myself, but as a child I saw 2 cops pulling a dead homeless guy out of a manhole. Don't know any other details though, I was walking to the bus station when I saw it. Edit, Grammar, plus the reply about toxic gases accumulating in the manhole. It's likely what happened to the poor guy, as it was in winter and he might have tried to seek a warmer place. I was sleeping next to my daughter and I woke up and she was gone. Very disturbing. There was vomit everywhere. Didn't find a dead body, but my best friend was shot and died in front of me on his birthday. One of my earlier jobs was a carer at a swanky end-of-life care home. I worked a skeleton crew at night, one person per floor, and was doing my rounds. I was in the room with a non-verbal lady whose life consisted of dribbling, twitching, and occasionally moaning. Couldn't communicate in any way, and she didn't have any family. I entered the room and saw she was awake. I said a few generic kind words and let her know what was happening as more of a courtesy than anything. I turned round to prep some personal care when I heard a weird exhale. Turned round and she was still in an unusual way. I wandered over and it took a second to register. Called the nurse, who arrived 2 minutes later, and yep, they had died. I began prepping the body for collection as the family was notified, and that was that. Found a few others dead over the months I was there, but that was the only one I was ever in the room with. My professor in college found one when he was in college. He was walking under a bridge and saw a garbage bag full of stuff and kicked it. When the smell hit him, he opened the bag and there was a woman inside. She has been raped and murdered. My professor carried a lot of guilt since then because she had been violated until her death and then even after death by him. He needed therapy.